Welcome to the week that was, TIOL's weekly news roundup. Yes, it is February and a time for the Union Budget. In our first episode of the Budget Month, we bring you a little trivia and traditions associated with the Indian budget. Asha, do you know why the budget is always presented on the last working day of February?
Yes, Sudipto, because this gives the Lok Sabha 1 month to review and modify the budget proposals before the commencement of the new financial year. But in an election year, the budget may be presented twice. First, to secure a vote on account for a few months for the government to manage its expenses, and then later in full.
Yes, and I remember the President Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, as the then Finance Minister, had presented the budget proposal on March 16, 2012, which was also a leap year. Did you know who presented India's first budget?
Yes, that's a tricky one, but it was Mr. R.K. Shanmukham Chetty, who was the finance minister in Jawaharlal Nehru's cabinet between 1947 and 1949. And he was the one who presented the first budget of independent India on November 26, 1947.
But historically speaking, this was not the first time the budget was presented in India. The budget predates independence. It was first introduced on April 7, 1860, after transfer of Indian administration from the East India Company to the British Crown. Then Mr. James Williams, who was the first Indian finance member who delivered the budget speech, probably at 5 p.m. in the evening.
True, that was a tradition from the colonial era that was changed. Mr. Yashwant Sinha changed this budget timing tradition by announcing in the 2001 Union Budget and presenting it at 11 a.m.
Another interesting fact is we keep using this expression budget, but this term budget is nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. In other words, it has no constitutional sanctity. Rather, Constitution uses the word annual financial statement of the government, which is to be laid before the Parliament. Do you know who has presented the maximum number of budgets in India?
Of course, the record is held by Mr. Morarji Desai. He presented a record number of 10 budgets, 2 of which were presented on February 29th, which was also his birthday. Chidambaram is just one behind in the total number of budget presentations.
Okay. Now coming back to 2016, it is the 29th day of this month, which is eagerly awaited by all of us because on this date, the Union Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, is going to present the third Union Budget of the present India government. But that was the budget trivia we had for this episode. Now let's start and see what news we have for our viewers today.
Let's start with some structural changes in tax administration.
Accepting some radical changes recommended by the Tax Administration Reform Committee, the government has created 2 new bodies, named the Tax Policy Research Unit and the Tax Policy Council. The role of the Tax Policy Council would be advisory, and it would make suggestions for broad policy measures for taxation based on the inputs from the Tax Policy Research Unit. The Tax Policy Council will have 9 more members comprising ministers, secretaries, and the deputy chairman of NITI Aayog, with the chairman CBDT and chairman CBAC to be special invitees. The Tax Policy Research Unit shall comprise of officers from both the Central Board of Direct Taxes and Central Board of Excise and Customs, as well as economists, statisticians, operational researchers, and legal experts. This unit shall be headed by the officer of the level of Chief Commissioner, who will report to the Revenue Secretary. So what happens to the assessees who do not file their IT returns?
The Income Tax Department actually went ahead and tracked down the assessees who had not filed their returns despite having an obligation to do so. In this special drive, the IT department identified nearly 6 million taxpayers, out of which more than 1 million actually filed their returns. In this initiative called the Non-Filers Management System, the department used technology intelligence tools to track the erring taxpayers. Lakhs of emails and text messages were sent to the taxpayers registered with the e-filing portal of the department, of which 1.17 million taxpayers filed their returns for assessment year 2014-15. The CBDT has signed its third bilateral advanced transfer pricing agreement.
Following the signing of advanced transfer pricing agreements with Japanese and American enterprises, the CBDT has now signed the third bilateral APAs with two UK-based firms. The agreements were signed with two Indian group entities of a UK-based multinational company for the period 2013-14 to 2017-18, with a rollback provision for 2 years. Such APAs signed for multiple years between a taxpayer and the tax authority on an appropriate transfer pricing methodology help in making taxes stable and predictable for foreign enterprises. The CBDT has in all signed 41 APAs, out of which 38 are unilateral and 3 are bilateral. Does running a small shop on the railway platform constitute a livelihood which is to be protected by the government?
In a scathing criticism of the government, the Supreme Court observed that the government's callous attitude and inaction in tackling the problem of rising unemployment was appalling. The Apex Court was hearing the plea of the South Central Railway Caterers Association that challenged the government's decision not to renew their licenses for stalls on railway platforms. The court noted that the government was taking harsh action against the small vendors while allowing the big private players to use railway property without any increase in license fees. The Apex Court directed the railways to allow the small vendors to carry on with their business, their livelihood. It may be recalled that the Apex Court in 1985 had included the right to livelihood as a part of the right to life under Article 21 of the Constitution. The eldest lady of the house can become the powerful karta of a Hindu undivided family.
Gender discrimination may be rampant in India, but the Hindu Succession Amendment Act may now well be the most progressive piece of legislation as interpreted by the Delhi High Court. The Hindu Succession Amendment Act 2005, which deals with intestate succession among Hindus, Buddhists, Jains and Sikhs, gave daughters an equal right in inheriting property but allowed only men to assume the powerful position of Karta in a Hindu undivided family. But now, taking this limited equality a logical step further, the Delhi High Court has done away with the last vestiges of gender discrimination by ruling that the eldest woman member of a family can become its Karta. A Karta, being the custodian and controller of joint family funds, has the right to manage, sell or gift family property. Although some courts had allowed women to act as Karta until the male member became an adult, it is true that many Hindu undivided families were dissolved on the death of the Karta when there was no male member to take over this position. This judgment is a precedent and may certainly save many families from extinction. However, some clarity is still needed on the rights of the children of a married woman who is the Karta in her father's family, or even whether women can now start a Hindu undivided family to be recognized by the Income Tax Department. How can rail projects be speedily implemented? With state participation, of course.
The government has allowed Indian Railways to form joint venture companies with state governments in order to ensure greater participation by the states in the speedy implementation of rail projects. These joint venture companies to be set up with equity participation by the Railway Ministry and the states will have an initial paid-up capital of Rs 100 crore, with the railway share being limited to Rs 50 crore for each state. The joint ventures shall be responsible for identifying projects, obtaining statutory approvals, land acquisition, project monitoring, and possible financing in addition to government funding. The joint venture company can also form project-specific SPVs with equity holding by other shareholders like banks, ports, public sector undertakings, and mining companies. The Indian Railways recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the state governments of Kerala and Andhra Pradesh for the formation of joint venture companies. This development follows the announcement for partnerships with state governments as made in the last rail budget. India may suffer a setback on obtaining black money information from Switzerland.
Just when the world thought that Swiss banking secrecy laws were melting at the edges, it seems Switzerland may backtrack on its proposed legislation for providing information about black money, which could prove to be a setback for India and other countries. Under pressure from the international community, the Swiss Federal Council had proposed a new law in September last year to provide administrative assistance and information for countries to track down its tax evaders. However, this draft law was severely criticized by most of the right-wing parties, which form the majority in the Swiss parliament. Hence, Switzerland now wants to postpone the parliamentary debate on the new law. This legislation would have helped Switzerland to avoid being blacklisted as a non-cooperative secrecy jurisdiction following the ongoing peer review by the Global Forum for Transparency and Exchange of Tax Information that includes 130 member countries, including India. Experts believe that it would be necessary for the new law to be passed before Switzerland's peer review process is completed. Otherwise, India could be stuck in an impasse. On the other hand, when our Finance Minister Mr. Arun Jaitley visited Davos last week, he announced after a bilateral meeting with his newly elected Swiss counterpart that Switzerland was very keen on greater cooperation in the fight against black money. Should we pay taxes if the government misuses taxpayers' money through corruption? Let's find out.
The Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court has made a novel suggestion. It asked citizens to launch a non-cooperation movement and refuse to pay taxes if the government is unable to control corruption. Justice Arun Chaudhary made this observation in a case of embezzlement of funds meant for the upliftment of the Matang community. While passing strictures on the Maharashtra government and Bank of Maharashtra for overlooking the corruption, he observed that ethics and morals have taken a back seat in modern India, and it is shocking how taxpayers' money is being swindled. He termed corruption as a hydra-headed monster, stating that it was high time citizens came together to tell their governments that they have had enough. Only then can the miasma of corruption be beaten. He also observed that the government has an onerous responsibility to prove to taxpayers that eradication of corruption is not a forlorn hope. Muslims must pay their taxes before leaving for Hajj, says an Islamic fatwa.
We all know religion and politics are irreversibly intertwined. But now there is a twist. Sunni Barelvi clerics of Dargah Ala Hazrat have issued a new fatwa. They have directed that under Islamic law, pilgrims must clear all their debts before embarking on Hajj. They reasoned that all type of taxes imposed by the government are debt, which must henceforth be cleared before Hajj. All types of taxes, be it house tax, income tax, even water tax, sewer and sales tax imposed by the government must be cleared. Pilgrims must also leave enough money at their home for their family members before embarking on Hajj. The obvious question is, has religion become the handmaiden of politics? So on this note, we conclude this episode of The Week That Was. Thank you for watching.
You may write in your comments at editor@tiol.in. Have a great weekend ahead.